Let's open up in prayer. Father, we thank you again for the opportunity to come and to study your word and to learn from this book of origins, of beginnings, and Lord, to see the message that you have in it for us, that you would teach us, that we would be excited about the things we learn, that we would grow in our knowledge of you, and we give you thanks in Jesus' name. Amen. So real quick, let's come up to speed. In Genesis chapter 1, we've covered a lot of ground so far, 5 verses. This all starts with a statement in verse 1. That statement is, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Now, the word beginning refers to the beginning of an event or the beginning of time or the beginning of an act. And we need to figure out what kind of beginning it is. It might refer to the beginning of all things, excluding God himself, if verse 1 stands as a prologue to the events that follow verse 2. We could see it this way. In the beginning of all time, God created the heavens, that is the above space. Heaven is used so many different ways in the Bible. Heaven is the dwelling place of God, but heaven is also the sky above us and the sky above the sky and outer space and all of these different ways that heaven is interpreted in the Bible. So in the beginning of all time, we could see it this way, that God created the heavens, that is the above space, the universal void where there would soon be stars and planets, or by heavens, he could refer to the spiritual realm where he dwells. So in the beginning, God created the place where he dwells. And by earth, it could mean this thing that we find in verse 2 that is without form and void. And the space between verse 1 and verse 2 brings to us more controversy. We would say maybe there's a gap there. So somebody has said, oh, gap. Maybe there's something called a gap theory. And gap theory is a popular belief, which, based on how much speculation exists in the theory, can or cannot, I believe, be a fitting possibility. Some say that the earth was inhabited between verse 1 and verse 2. Some say that. And that God destroyed the earth and covered it with a flood like he would do again in chapter 6. And there are many problems with this idea. There are many things with this idea that may answer some questions, but there are problems. First off, if it were true, then God also destroyed in that first event in the gap that we don't know anything about. He also destroyed the sun that this planet first orbited around, but preserved it from utter destruction and merely flooded it, if that gap theory idea is true. The main problem here is that this theory that is partially deduced from fossil records, this is a way to justify the billions of years and to explain dating that goes back that far by still looking at the Genesis account. And here's what I have to say about all that billions of years stuff and all that dating and all that fossil record stuff. That's for somebody else. That's somebody else's calling. That's somebody else's mission. I cannot and will not get into the science of creation or the fossil record, because Genesis is not a scientific account. I'm here to teach the book that we have right here. I'm not here to teach what other people do with it. That's their ministry, it's not mine. It's an ancient description used in ancient terms to explain the creation of our world, and we'll do our best to look at it and understand it in context. Remember, that was one of our ground rules. We're going to look at this in the ancient context it was written in, and to the people who would read it in that time period and try to understand it in that context. The other big problem with the gap theory is that it reports a previous world of life. If that's the case, then what the Bible teaches us about death, it says death did not enter into the world until there was sin. Well, sin didn't enter into the world until Genesis 3. So how could there have been death? However, this does not mean that there wasn't a gap. We know that the first recorded event of creation was verse 3. The formless earth preexisted that. We don't know how long it preexisted that. The formless earth was just there when we started. We don't know how long. It makes sense that there was a gap, but it's hard to say gap because there's a lot of baggage with that word because everyone's applied all kinds of meanings and stories and definitions to it. But it appears as if there was a gap, even if it makes little sense that life previously existed there. Also, the record of creation, sin, life, death, all of that begins within the confines of this recorded event of creation. So the question is, if there was life on this planet before Genesis 2, we are not told about it. Therefore, since we're not told about it, it's not part of our story, and therefore, it's not any of my business as a Bible teacher. So you guys can dig into that, have fun with it. That's not what I'm doing. So the word beginning most likely refers to the beginning of an event, and that event is the creation story, which begins in verse 3. So our God, who is a three-in-one being, pre-existed this event for all eternity. It's likely that there was also a multitude of heavenly hosts, created Elohim, who existed with him in the supernatural realm. And verse 2 sets the stage. There is darkness and there is the deep. These are the things that we find when creation begins. And the people of this time would have interpreted that as chaos and disorder. When they saw that word, the deep or the ocean or the water, in their minds they would have said, oh, that means chaos. That means disorder. It was truly darkness, and it truly was the deep. Things can represent something and still be the real thing at the same time. So, it was truly darkness. It was truly a planet covered in water. But when a person of this time period considered floods and the ocean, it figuratively meant chaos and disorder to them. It meant that. It had meaning. Right before things began to change, right before the initial miracle in this creation event is recorded, we find the presence of God's Spirit hovering, as we saw last week, vibrating or flapping in anticipation. And then God spoke, literally saying, "Let light be." That's the breakdown of this in Hebrew. Just let it be. Somebody wrote a song about that later on. Now, the question is, if God is speaking, who or what is God speaking to? And this is probably irrelevant. This is probably more about how we think than how God thinks. We think if someone is speaking, someone must be listening. We think that words are spoken for communication. For God, this was his main method and his means of creation, so he spoke it into being, and it simply became. Did he speak to anything? No, it doesn't appear that he did. He just spoke it. But he did speak this in the presence of darkness and chaos. And this would have been a significant message to the ancient people. Many would say he confronted darkness and chaos, and he commanded the existence of something that would defeat both darkness and chaos. In fact, the other creation accounts in this time period, and there are at least three that we'll talk about briefly. There's a Mesopotamian account, and there's a Ugaritic literature account. The Ugarites were people who lived in modern-day Syria. They kind of disappeared around 1200 BC, but they had stone tablets that people have interpreted. Mesopotamian literature is available. And they have a creation story, and they claim that there was a conflict between the divine of chaos. Both their stories kind of start like that. And creation came about as a victory over chaos. Now, the Egyptian story, which we'll look at more in depth at the end of our study, states that their main god, whose name is Nun, very fitting, Nun, the creator god, or the water god, the creator god evolved out from Nun, the water god, and rose up out of the waters of chaos and began creation. So the Egyptians even have a similar story. Now in our story, the God who is eternal didn't come into existence through creation, like in the Egyptian story, but he held all the power and all the authority over creation. And in his first act, he took on the darkness and he brought separation and he brought definition. And we mentioned briefly last week that the phrase there was evening and there was morning, it literally is a figure of speech that simply means the beginning and the end of an event. Were they 24-hour days? Were they not 24-hour days? I like to lean heavy on the most omnipotent God version of the story, and I like to consider it to be 24-hour days, but it could work either way. So that brings us to verse 6 of Genesis chapter 1. Verse 6, and God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters that were under the expanse from the waters that were above the expanse. And it was so. And God called the expanse heaven, and there was evening and there was morning the second day. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. So in the previous act of creation, God brought separation, order, and definition to a place that was dominated by darkness and chaos. In this act of creation, he's doing the same thing, but this time he's bringing separation, order, and definition to the chaotic side of that void and formless earth, the water. And yes, this is literally speaking of water. This isn't figurative. And yes, the ancient people would have recognized that this was water, but they also would have seen this as a message of God confronting chaos. One thing we need to understand in Hebrew literature is that there's a lot of figurative language. There's a lot of poetry. If we actually read Hebrew and got into it, they actually will do things. They will rhyme with certain words, and they will play off certain words with other words that rhyme with them. And there's a lot of really neat poetical stuff going on in the Hebrew. We don't speak Hebrew, so we'll just acknowledge that exists out there. But we'll touch on it a little bit. So we need to understand that in Hebrew literature, there's a lot of figurative language. There's a lot of poetry. But just because something carries a figurative meaning doesn't mean that it's not also literal. People are often uncomfortable with the creation account we are now reading because in the Hebrew, it has some poetic elements to it. There are refrains, certain phrases that are said over and over again. It's not traditional Hebrew poetry, but they look at it and it's broken up and they say there are poetic elements to it. So sometimes people bristle when they hear, oh no, it's a poem. That means you're trying to say it's not real. You're trying to say it's an illustration. You're trying to say it's figurative. And so this is not true. When something is a figurative illustration, it will be very obvious and the poetic essence of the literature will be more certain. So here chaos is confronted and God brings order to it. The water is confronted. God literally divides it into two. So what does he use? He uses the thing that my Bible calls the expanse. And yours might call it the firmament. It's also translated heavens almost every single time in the Bible. If you do a search on this word and you go, how is it translated? It's heavens almost every single time. Sometimes it's translated sky. It's an interesting word. It could literally be translated like a beaten metal plate. If you take a piece of metal and you beat it into a shield, that's what this word means. Something that is beaten out or spread out. And if they would look up and they would say something is a vaulted dome, that would be probably the purest explanation of what they would say an expanse is. It speaks of something spread out. In this case, the waters that covered the earth were divided. Some remained on the earth in the form of the deep, and some of it was carried up above the expanse or the dome that God created. And this created unique This created a unique climate for the earth. Some have proposed that the entire planet would have been like a giant tropical greenhouse in this time period all the way up to Genesis 6. In verse 8, God called this vaulted dome heaven, which isn't referring to the spiritual realm where God dwells, which is how we would usually interpret heaven. This speaks of the sky. And as I mentioned, the Old Testament almost exclusively uses this word for heavens in the sense of what is up above us. There are a few cases where it's interpreted as the word air. Whenever it says birds of the air, it uses this word, birds of the firmament. When Moses threw soot in the air, that would then bring about the boils, that curse. When he threw the soot in the air, the soot in the air, it said that he threw it into the firmament. But almost every other case, it's translated as heavens. Now, it's worth noting that even after this expanse is broken in chapter 6, and the great flood comes down upon the earth, and there is no longer a layer of water above the expanse, it is still, throughout the scriptures, called heaven. The word continues to be used. So when people looked up, that's what they saw. They would say, there's a big vaulted dome above us, spread out around the earth, the heaven, or what we might call the atmosphere, the point of division between our sky and outer space. Verse 9, and God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. God called the dry land earth, and the waters that were gathered together he called seas. And God saw that it was good. And God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind on the earth. And it was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed according to their own kinds, and trees bearing fruit, in which is their seed, each according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening and there was morning the third day. So this was a busy day. There's a lot going on this day. God continued to bring even more order to the chaos after he divided it in the previous act of creation. He defined it in this act. Now, with dry land on the scene, the parts where the water was assigned was named the seas. God looked at it and God said, I like this. I like it. This is good. In verse 11, God began to do something with the land. Did he create a land? That's something I always think about. God said, just let the plants be, and they were. It's like when he created the land, did he create it with the seeds in it, ready to germinate? Or did he spontaneously bring growing plants into existence? And the answer is I can't even guess. He spoke light into being. He can definitely speak plants into being. And these plants, though different, were defined in category according to its kind. That word kind literally means category. It's not like species. A kind is different than a species. A kind or category refers to something with the same ancestral gene pool. A species would arise when a population is isolated and inbreeding occurs. So by definition, a species is not a kind, but a further partitioning of the existing kind. That's why when Darwin went to Galapagos and he saw all the different kinds of finches, they were all different species of one kind. So far we have plants growing, we have day and night defined, but we don't have the sun, we don't have the moon, and we don't have the stars. It seems as if God is doing some things in a different order. And this lets us know that light in and of itself, as God created it, as the raw created material spoken by him, is sufficient to do what we fully depend upon the sun to do. Plants were growing, they were alive, there was day, there was night, yet there was no sun, there was no moon, there were no stars. Now we get to verse 14, and God said, let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. Now there already was a system of separation in place. This has kind of slipped into that form and replaced it. And let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years, and let them be lights in the expanse of the heavens to give light upon the earth. And it was so. And God made two great lights, the greater light to rule the day and the lesser light to rule the night, and the stars. And God set them in the expanse of the heavens to give light on the earth, to rule over the day and over the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening and there was morning the fourth day. So we already have a separation of day and night, but now it has more definition. Now there will be lights in the expanse of the heavens, and we also get the moon and we get the stars. Now, since the time frame of light and dark, day and night, has already been established, these created elements can just kind of plug into creation and they can take their place. Now, a lot of people go out of their way to criticize the order of creation, like they could create anything. But they criticize it and they attack it for being unscientific. But this wasn't written to satisfy our scientific knowledge. This was written to declare God's glory and to speak a unique message to the people of this day. For instance, the stars, the sun, and the moon, they came along later and they serve as a role. They serve in a role as signs for seasons and for days and for years. They have a job. A person could track the number of sunsets and the placement of the stars and the phases of the moon, and they could record dates and seasons accordingly. And these things act like hands on a clock, or as signs or as indicators in the sky. They speak messages that people in the Bible would learn to understand and would learn to read. And people who really knew these things would actually be able to figure out, for instance, when the Messiah was going to be born in a place called Bethlehem. These signs would be significant. But the Babylonian and other ancient peoples of this time would have had a different view. To them, these stars were not mere luminaries. They weren't just lights laid out in a certain order, moving throughout the sky at different times of the year. To them, they were animated beings who were associated with their gods. These stars represented something huge to the ancient person. They were deities that controlled things, that created things, that were in charge of human affairs. But now they're simply just light bulbs in the sky. So they are written in this order, I believe, with purpose to say these things which are your gods, they're not. They're just little lights. The true light is what God has created, the all-powerful God. Verse 20, and God said, let the waters swarm with swarms of living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the heavens. So God created the great sea creatures and every living creature that moves, with which the waters swarm according to their kind, and every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. And God blessed them, saying, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the waters in the seas, and let birds multiply on the earth. And there was evening and there was morning the fifth day. And God said, let the earth bring forth living creatures according to their kinds, livestock and creeping things and beasts of the earth according to their kinds. And it was so. And God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. So a lot of things being established in their own unique genetic categories. As we look at this, God is establishing a pattern. It's almost as if he makes a container before he makes the contents. He made darkness and chaos, and he put light and order into it. He made a system of light and darkness, day and night, and then he plugged the sun, the moon, and the stars into that system. He made dry land because he needed a place for these plants and these trees to grow. He made the oceans, and he made land with plants on it so that he would be able to put sustainable life in both places. swarms of smaller life, and then great sea creatures in the water, birds in the sky, animals on the land according to their category. And once all this life was established, God would create something else. He would create man. We're not really going to talk about God creating man tonight, but all of these things needed something to bring order to it. So he would create man to have dominion over all of these things. We're going to get into that next week. But at this point, I want to turn our thoughts to another creation story and bring out something in the way the Old Testament is written at times that I find kind of interesting. Now, as I mentioned earlier, other ancient people groups had stories of creation that were similar. They had a lot of similar stories to the Old Testament. And these are found in the Ugaritic literature, and the Mesopotamian literature, and the Egyptian literature. And they all start the same. They all start with the deep, with primordial waters. And they all have similarities, but the Egyptian story has some very distinct similarities. And we will see in their creation story something revealing about this creation story that we're studying right now. We will find as we study through the Old Testament that some things are written almost as direct jabs at other religious systems, at other gods, or at other beliefs. They might have their religious story, but the writers of the Old Testament, responding under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit by flaunting the greatness of Yahweh over the gods of the other nations, would word things in a way that were actually known by these people who read this in this time. They were aware of it. It's like, hey, that's a jab at Baal, or that's a jab at what the Babylonians believed. One of the most prominent forms of this that repeats itself in the Old Testament has to do with a cycle of stories that pagan religions used to worship Baal. And it was called, to tell the story of Baal, and these cycle of stories, they were called the Baal cycle. And so for them to worship Baal, or Baal Hadad as they called him, they would use these stories. Now we get these stories from the ancient tablets recovered in Syria from the Ugaritic people. And they wrote extensively about their religion and their worship of a god named Baal Hadad. And you can look it up, Baal Cycle, Google it. You can actually read a lot of these stories, and you might see a lot of familiar language in them. And that's intentional. The stories, the verses, and the descriptions about Baal were commonplace knowledge in the ancient world. Everybody knew these stories. It was very common to them. The stories gave Baal specific descriptions and specific names. And the Old Testament writers, many times over, intentionally used the descriptions and the names found in these Baal cycle stories to describe God. They would do it. And a lot of people would say, oh no, are they using pagan terms to describe God? It's like, no, actually, they're using the same language to describe and elevate God over their gods. It was a way to provoke them, to prod them. Like, you, O God, are greater than all the other gods. And language would be used, which was copied from these other religions, as kind of a mockery, a way to prod them, a way to elevate the might of Yahweh. One of the most thorough examples you find in Daniel 7. So I'll give you an example. The Baal cycle says, and Baal and El were the two main gods in the worship of Baal. El was supposed to be the greatest god, but Baal did all the work and took all the glory. So it says, El, the aged high god, is the ultimate sovereign in the council. Then Daniel 7 says, the Ancient of Days, the God of Israel, is seated on the fiery wheeled throne. And then the Baal cycle says, El bestows kingship upon the god Baal, the cloud rider. That's significant, the cloud rider. Daniel 7 says, Yahweh, the Ancient of Days, bestows kingship upon the Son of Man who rides the clouds. The Baal cycle says, Baal is king of the gods of El's vizier. His rule is everlasting. Daniel 7 says, the Son of Man is given everlasting dominion over the nations. He rules at the right hand of God. These kinds of examples are all over the Bible. And when the ancient person heard these descriptions, and they're in Daniel 7, they're in Isaiah chapter 19, verse 1, Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 26, Psalm 68, verse 33, Psalm 104, verse 3, just a few examples. They knew what was going on. The prophets of Yahweh weren't imitating the writings of these other pagan worshipers. They were actually elevating Yahweh over them and mocking them with the same language. So the most prominent expression of this is the name Cloud Rider. There are many times in the Bible where Yahweh is described, and even Jesus, as coming on the clouds. I mean, maybe you have a song in your head right now. Behold, he comes, riding on the clouds. That, every time we sing it, it's a mockery against the Baal cycle. Every time you see that, it's a jab at Baal worship. It's an expression of superiority, and it's literally meant to be to belittle the false gods of Baal. So there are strong parallels. Now back to the Egyptian story. Something similar is going on there with our creation story. There are strong parallels beyond Egyptian story of creation and our story of creation. And many scholars believe that our story, the superior, pure, and true story, was written in a way to express the superiority of Yahweh and to belittle the story of the Egyptians. The Egyptians had 4 different stories of creation, but they all followed a very similar pattern. They both start with a pre-creation condition, lifeless, chaotic, watery deep. So far, it's very, very familiar with our story of creation, with the Ugaritic story, with the Mesopotamian story. In the Egyptian story, from the waters, which to them is the god called Nun, emerged or came into being the god Atum, who would be their creator god. So we got 2 gods so far. One was the water, and the other was one that just kind of evolved or appeared or came into being out of the water, who would be the creator god. And it says the breath of Atum moved over the waters. So it sounds familiar, right? Our story, the Spirit, the breath of God, hovered over the water. Our God didn't come into being. Our God has always existed. In the Egyptian story, there was the appearance of a supernatural light when Atum was generated, but our God spoke light into being. Then the Egyptian story has the emergence of a hill in the midst of the water. Just this land popped up in the midst of their god Nun. But the Bible has the creation of the firmament in the midst of the waters. The Egyptian story has a similar separation of the waters, but for them the god Nun was raised over the earth, and the god Shu was created in the middle. So like everything has a god, is a god. In the Bible, God simply separated the waters with the power of his word. The Egyptian story speaks of a heavenly ocean being created, and that heavenly ocean is the god. His name's really interesting. His name is Nut, N-U-T. He's a real nut. And the Bible ascribes the creation of this simply to the powerful act of God's spoken power. The creation of humans in the Egyptian story. Where did humans come from? The Egyptians will say, well, that was kind of an accident. We didn't really mean to create humans, but tears from Atum hit the soil of the earth, and humans sprung up. But in the Bible, God created humans in his image, with his breath, with his hands, and with soil, with purpose. The Egyptian story sets the sun to have dominion over the earth, but the Bible creates God's imagers to have dominion over it. In both accounts, at the end, the creator figure completes the activity and rests in satisfaction. So great parallels here. There are, remember, 4 versions of the story in Egypt. Some of the contrasts are more profound. In one Egyptian day, gods, statutes, cult sites, and food offerings are created, while on that same day, in our version, man is God's divine image, food for man to eat, and the call to have dominion was created. So basically, here's the summary of this. Genesis 1 is believed to be a literary polemic. And a polemic is an attack on someone or something. So pretty much anything a politician says, nowadays. So it was a literary polemic, an attack designed to refute ancient Near Eastern creation mythology. Specifically, it appears to be pointed directly at Egyptian mythology in particular. So you could say, why was the creation story written this way? Well, part of the reason it was written this way is because God inspired it to be written this way. This was the account that was known by the people from early on, from the very beginning. But another reason it would have been written this way is to refute the views and the ideas that over time had become distorted. Because remember, before this was written down, the story existed. The story was told from person to person, from generation to generation. The story always existed. So when it was actually written down, it was written down in such a way to where it also would serve to directly attack and refute the pagan beliefs of those who had corrupted the ultimate message. Now let's conclude with the big question. Which came first? The chicken or the egg kind of question. There are many similar stories in the Bible and the ancient world that the Bible was written in the midst of. There's common stories of creation. There are common stories of the flood. There's a common belief in a supernatural divine counsel. There's common stories surrounding the Nephilim, or they're sometimes called the Watchers, who are the offspring of certain fallen Elohim and the daughters of man. And you might ask, how is it that so many different religious and social groups have very similar stories that we have in our Bible? And I think the answer is pretty simple. Let's look at the creation story. I imagine the creation story started quite early, maybe even shared with Adam and Eve by God directly in the garden. And for generations, it was passed down from person to person, spoken the same way. The same story with the same words and the same order and the same message. It was spoken, and they would learn it and they would pass it down to another generation. And as the story went into different places and different nations, it began to take on a different flavor. Just look what our modern culture has done to redefine Christianity in the past 100 years. Look at how differently people think about Christianity. The Bible hasn't changed, but it's been redefined significantly by many people. So it's not hard to imagine how these stories could bend themselves to the cultures that they moved into. They all began as this common creation story. It's not hard to imagine how over time they would change. Also, major events like a worldwide flood. Do you think that, that story would have continued on beyond Noah into many different generations, many different families, many different nations? Different stories about these giants who are in the land. Other people would have seen them. Other people would have experienced them. Other groups would have noticed them and would have had their own ways of explaining them or talking about them. So for us, it becomes an issue of faith. Which came first? Which story bears the most weight? Which version is the most significant? And I think that you will find that as you study through the entirety of the Bible, that you will see how perfectly and how intricately God's plan is and how perfectly it's fulfilled in Christ, especially when we come up to this great transition point in chapter 11 of Genesis and how it just lays out this great need and this incredible plan of redemption that is then described and defined throughout the rest of the Bible. So that's all the further we're going to go tonight. We will pick up with the creation of man next week. We'll take a few moments. If anyone has any questions, we can answer them. Nope, no questions? No? Aaron?